When the police siren screamed through my quiet ranch at 7:30 a.m. on a peaceful Saturday morning, I watched from my porch as 3 squad cars pulled into my driveway with their lights blazing. Behind them, Millicent Ashford stood at my property line with her arms crossed and a smirk that could have curdled fresh milk. What she didn't know was that she'd just walked into the most beautiful legal trap I'd ever set, and Sheriff Castellano was about to become the star of my revenge story. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a simple vegetable garden turned into the downfall of the most notorious HOA president in Copper Ridge Estates. My name is Thaddeus Blackwood, though most folks call me Thad. And 6 months ago, I thought I'd found my slice of paradise when I bought the corner property at Copper Ridge. The real estate listing had specifically mentioned agricultural zoning overlay, which meant I could have a small ranch operation alongside the residential use. Perfect for a guy like me, who'd spent 25 years serving his country and just wanted to grow some tomatoes and raise a few chickens in peace. The property came with 5 acres, mostly hidden behind a natural ridge that gave the neighborhood its name, and the previous owner had already set up some basic ranch infrastructure, including a chicken coop and tool shed. The first sign of trouble came exactly 1 week after I moved in. I was out feeding my 6 heritage breed chickens when a woman appeared at my fence line like she'd materialized from thin air. Millicent Ashford introduced herself with the kind of fake smile that made my old combat instincts kick in immediately. She was in her late 40s with perfectly styled auburn hair and wore what looked like a business suit to inspect my chicken coop at 8 in the morning. "Welcome to Copper Ridge, Mr. Blackwood," she said. Though her tone suggested I was anything but welcome, "I'm the HOA president, and I wanted to personally inform you about our community standards regarding livestock and agricultural activities." She pulled out a folder thick enough to use as a weapon and began flipping through pages with practiced efficiency. I leaned against my fence post and studied her carefully while she rattled off a list of restrictions that seemed to multiply by the second. No roosters, no more than 4 chickens, no visible garden structures from the street, no composting within 50 feet of property lines, and about 24 other rules that basically meant I couldn't sneeze without HOA approval. The interesting thing was how she kept glancing at my tool shed like she was cataloging future violations, and I noticed she was taking photos with her phone while pretending to check her notes. "Ma'am, I appreciate the welcome wagon," I said when she finally paused for breath. "But this property has agricultural overlay zoning. I checked with the county before buying, and none of these HOA restrictions apply to agricultural activities on AG-zoned land." Her smile flickered like a bad light bulb before returning full force. "I think you'll find our HOA covenant supersedes any county technicalities. Mr. Blackwood, we've worked very hard to maintain certain standards in Copper Ridge, and I'd hate to see you start off on the wrong foot with your new neighbors." The threat was about as subtle as a hand grenade, but I dealt with worse. What caught my attention was how she said neighbors while gesturing toward the other houses, yet I'd already met most of them, and they'd all been friendly and excited about having fresh eggs available. Something told me Millicent's definition of neighborhood consensus might be a bit one-sided. That afternoon, I made a few phone calls to some old friends who'd retired to various government positions around the state. What I learned about Millicent Ashford was fascinating. She'd been HOA president for 5 years, during which time she'd issued more fines than the previous 4 presidents combined. She'd also been involved in 3 lawsuits against homeowners, winning 2 on technicalities and settling the 3rd out of court. But the really interesting part was a pattern of targeting new residents within their first few months, especially those who showed any signs of not conforming to her vision of suburban perfection. 2 weeks passed in relative peace while I quietly established my ranch garden. I planted 3 rows of heirloom tomatoes, a patch of summer squash, green beans, and a selection of herbs that would make any chef jealous. The chicken coop got some upgrades, including an automatic door and a predator-proof run extension. Everything was done by the book with proper permits, where required, and even a survey to confirm all structures were within agricultural use guidelines. My neighbor Ezra Fitzgerald, a spry 78-year-old who'd lived in Copper Ridge since it was built, stopped by one evening while I was installing irrigation lines. He watched me work for a while before speaking up in his distinctive gravelly voice. "You know she's gonna come after you hard, don't you? Millicent can't stand it when someone doesn't bow down to her authority." I figured as much, I replied, testing the water pressure on the new lines. But I've dealt with bigger bullies than her. Ezra chuckled and leaned on his walking stick. I bet you have. Noticed that Special Forces tattoo on your arm the other day? Marines? Army. Delta Force. Actually, I normally didn't advertise my service history. But something about Ezra made me feel like he needed to know. His eyes lit up with interest. No kidding? My grandson just joined the Rangers? Says it's the toughest thing he's ever done. He paused, looking thoughtful. You know, Millicent has no idea who she's picking a fight with. Does she? Probably not. I agreed, but I'm hoping to resolve this peacefully. I just want to grow my vegetables and take care of my chickens. Ezra's laugh was sharp and knowing. Son, Millicent Ashford doesn't do peaceful. She does total submission or total war. There's no middle ground with that woman. He started to walk away but turned back with a grin. When you decide to fight back, let me know. I've got 20 years of her violations documented, including some very interesting financial irregularities. That night, I sat on my porch planning garden expansions and thinking about what Ezra had said. The old soldier in me recognized the value of intelligence gathering, so I started my own research into HOA operations. What I found in the public records was illuminating. The HOA's financial reports showed some curious patterns in vendor payments and maintenance costs that didn't quite add up. But more interesting were the number of homes that had been sold in the past 5 years, after owners received multiple violations and fines. The peace shattered on a Thursday morning when I found a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. According to Millicent, my chickens had been creating noise disturbances, and my garden was visible from the street in violation of aesthetic guidelines. The fine was $500 with 7 days to pay or face legal action. The real kicker was the date and time of the alleged violation, 3 a.m. on Tuesday morning. When my chickens were locked in their silent coop and my garden was invisible in the darkness, I knew this was her opening salvo. So I responded with careful precision. First, I installed security cameras covering every inch of my property, including infrared models that could capture perfect video in total darkness. Then I filed a formal dispute of the violation with the HOA board, requesting evidence of the complaints and documentation of the investigation process. Finally, I sent certified letters to all board members requesting a hearing date and informing them of my property's agricultural zoning exemption. Millicent's response came faster than expected. The very next day, she showed up with 2 other board members I hadn't met before. Dolores Quincy, a severe-looking woman in her 60s who apparently served as treasurer, and Bernard Hutchins, a nervous man who kept adjusting his glasses and avoiding eye contact. They insisted on a property inspection that felt more like an invasion force scouting for weaknesses. Mr. Blackwood, Millicent began as they stood at my garden gate. We're here to document the full extent of your violations. I trust you won't impede our official HOA business? I smiled and opened the gate wide. By all means. Please come in. I'll even give you the tour. Just watch out for the motion-activated sprinklers. They're on a timer and can be quite surprising. As if on cue, the sprinkler system activated, sending precise streams of water across the tomato beds. Dolores jumped back with a shriek as a few drops hit her shoes. While Bernard fumbled with his clipboard, only Millicent maintained her composure, though I noticed her jaw clench as she stepped carefully around the wet areas. Your irrigation system seems excessive, she noted, photographing everything with her phone. I'm sure there are water usage restrictions we need to discuss. Actually, I said, pulling out my own phone to show documentation. This is a smart irrigation system that uses 40% less water than traditional sprinklers. The county water authority gave me a rebate for installing it. Would you like to see the commendation letter they sent? She ignored the offer and moved toward the chicken coop, where my 6 hens were peacefully scratching in their run. These chickens are clearly too many for a residential property. The limit is 4. On residential property. Yes, I agreed, but this section is zoned agricultural. I can legally have up to 50 chickens here. I'm showing considerable restraint with just 6. Bernard finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. The covenants do specify that agricultural use must not create nuisances for neighbors. Have there been complaints? This was the opening I'd been waiting for. That's an excellent question. Bernard, I've actually surveyed all my adjacent neighbors. I pulled out a folder of my own. Here are signed statements from all 8 households that border my property, stating they have no objections to my chickens or garden. In fact, Mrs. Chen, 2 doors down, specifically mentions how much she enjoys the fresh eggs I share. Millicent's face went through several interesting color changes as she read through the statements. These neighbors may not understand the long-term implications of allowing agricultural activities to expand unchecked as HOA board members. We have to think about the bigger picture. Speaking of the bigger picture, I said casually, I've been reviewing the HOA's financial statements. There seem to be some interesting patterns in the landscaping contracts. Didn't your husband's company, Ashford Landscaping, receive a rather substantial contract increase last year? The silence that followed was deafening. Dolores suddenly became very interested in her shoes, while Bernard's glasses adjusting reached a frantic pace. Millicent's smile finally disappeared entirely, replaced by a look that could have frozen lava. I don't appreciate implications. Mr. Blackwood, everything the board does is completely above board and transparent. I'm sure it is, I replied mildly. Just like I'm sure my security cameras will show that any future violations are legitimate and not fabricated. Amazing what modern technology can reveal, isn't it? They left shortly after that, but not before Millicent delivered a parting shot. This isn't over, Mr. Blackwood. The board takes its responsibilities very seriously, and we will not allow one resident to destroy the character of our community. That evening, Ezra stopped by with a 6-pack of beer and a knowing grin. Heard Millicent's inspection team got a bit wet today. The whole neighborhood's talking about it. News travels fast around here, I said, accepting a beer gratefully. Faster than you might think, he agreed. Dolores Quincy called my wife this afternoon, asking questions about you. Wanted to know if we'd felt pressured to sign that support statement. And my wife told her the only pressure she felt was from Millicent's constant harassment about her rose garden being 2 inches too tall last summer. He took a long pull from his beer. You've got more support than you know, Thad. People are tired of living in fear of that woman. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued expanding my garden while documenting everything meticulously. Every seed planted, every improvement made, every interaction with neighbors was recorded and filed. I also started attending county planning meetings and making connections with local officials who were surprisingly interested in my agricultural preservation efforts. The escalation came on a Monday morning that started like any other. I was out collecting eggs when I noticed something wrong. My main garden gate was open, and several of my tomato plants had been trampled. Fresh footprints led through the squash patch, and someone had clearly tried to damage the irrigation lines. Though the commercial-grade equipment had survived the attempt, my security cameras told the whole story. At 2:47 a.m., a figure in dark clothing had entered my property and systematically attempted to destroy my garden. They'd been careful to avoid showing their face, but they'd made one crucial mistake. The car parked just outside camera range had a distinctive parking sticker from Millicent's husband's business. Instead of confronting her directly, I took a different approach. I compiled the footage along with documentation of the damage and filed a police report for vandalism and trespassing. Then I sent copies to every HOA board member with a polite note explaining that I was sure they'd want to address criminal activity in our safe neighborhood. The next board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening, and I made sure to arrive early. The community center was fuller than usual, with at least 30 residents in attendance, many of whom I recognized as fellow recipients of Millicent's arbitrary fines. Ezra was there with his wife, along with the Chens who'd been fined for their koi pond, the Jacksons who'd fought a violation for their children's playground, and several others I'd been quietly networking with. Millicent called the meeting to order, with obvious displeasure at the packed room. Before we begin the regular agenda, I believe Mr. Blackwood has requested time to address the board. I stood and made my way to the front, carrying a laptop and a stack of documents. Thank you, Madam President. I'm here to discuss the criminal vandalism of my property and the pattern of harassment I've experienced since moving to Copper Ridge. That's a serious accusation. Dolores interjected quickly. Perhaps this is a matter for law enforcement rather than the HOA board? I agree completely, I said, connecting my laptop to the projection system. That's why I've already filed a police report. But since this directly relates to HOA business and violations issued against my property, I believe the board and community should see the evidence. The room went completely silent as I played the security footage. The timestamp was clear, the vandalism obvious, and while the perpetrator's face wasn't visible, several people audibly gasped when the car's parking sticker became visible in the enhanced footage. I didn't accuse anyone directly, just presented the facts and let people draw their own conclusions. Furthermore, I continued, pulling up financial documents. I've discovered some interesting patterns in HOA enforcement over the past 5 years. Properties that receive multiple violations have an 80% chance of being sold within 12 months. Even more interesting, 3 of those properties were subsequently purchased by Ashford Property Holdings LLC. Isn't that your husband's investment company? Millicent? The explosion I expected didn't come. Instead, Millicent went very still and very quiet, which was somehow more unnerving than shouting would have been. When she finally spoke, her voice was ice-cold and perfectly controlled. I motioned to adjourn this meeting due to the inappropriate nature of these unfounded accusations. Mr. Blackwood, you'll be hearing from the HOA's attorney regarding your slanderous implications, but Bernard, finally finding his spine, spoke up. Actually, I'd like to see more of these documents. As treasurer, Dolores should be able to explain these financial patterns, shouldn't she? What followed was the most beautiful unraveling I'd ever witnessed. Dolores stammered through non-explanations while other board members asked increasingly pointed questions. Residents started sharing their own experiences with suspicious violations and excessive fines. The meeting that Millicent had tried to adjourn continued for another 2 hours as years of frustration finally found its voice. By the end of the evening, 3 things had been accomplished. First, an emergency audit of HOA finances was approved by board vote over Millicent's strenuous objections. Second, all current violations were suspended, pending review of enforcement procedures. And third, a special election was called to potentially reorganize the entire board leadership. As people filed out, many stopped to shake my hand or share their own stories. The Chens revealed they'd been fined 6 times in 2 years for increasingly trivial violations. The Jacksons had nearly moved away after being threatened with a lawsuit over their children's swing set. Story after story painted a picture of a community held hostage by one woman's power trip, but I knew Millicent wouldn't go down without a fight. As I packed up my laptop, she approached me with a smile that would have made a shark nervous. You think you're clever? Don't you? The decorated soldier coming in to save the day? Her voice was quiet enough that only I could hear. You have no idea what you've started. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd never set foot in Copper Ridge. I met her Gaza steadily. Ma'am, I've faced down warlords and terrorists. A suburban HOA president doesn't even make my top 10 list of intimidating opponents. She leaned closer, and I caught a whiff of expensive perfume mixed with barely controlled rage. Those warlords didn't have the law on their side. I do. And tomorrow morning, you're going to learn exactly what that means. As she stalked away, I noticed Ezra waiting by the door with a concerned expression. You know she's going to call in every favor she has, right? Her brother-in-law is a judge, and she's got connections throughout the county government. I'm counting on it, I said with a smile that probably looked a bit feral. In fact, I'm hoping she pulls out all the stops. Why's that? Because when someone's desperate enough to use every weapon they have, they usually forget to watch their flanks. And I've been setting up one hell of a flanking maneuver. Ezra's grin matched mine as understanding dawned. You've got something planned. Let's just say tomorrow morning is going to be very educational for everyone involved. Millicent wants to escalate. She's about to learn what escalation really looks like when you're dealing with someone who wrote the book on tactical operations. That night, I made several phone calls to old friends who'd transitioned into various civilian positions. Sheriff Hector Castellano was particularly interested in the vandalism footage and the financial irregularities I'd uncovered. District Attorney Delilah Winters found the pattern of property sales following HOA harassment fascinating from a legal perspective, and investigative journalist Nadia Volkov practically salivated over the documentation I'd compiled over the past months. As I sat on my porch watching the stars and listening to my chickens settling in for the night, I reflected on how a simple desire to grow vegetables had turned into a full-scale tactical operation. But sometimes that's what it takes to stand up to a bully. Sometimes you have to show them that their perceived power is nothing more than smoke and mirrors, ready to dissolve at the first sign of real resistance. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You've made a big mistake. Enjoy your last night in that house." I screenshot the threat and added it to my evidence file. Then I poured myself a whiskey and raised a toast to the quiet night. Tomorrow, Millicent Ashford would learn why you never corner a Delta Force operator, especially one who's been preparing for this moment since the day she first knocked on his door. The war was about to begin in earnest, and I had a feeling the casualties would all be on one side. After all, I'd spent decades perfecting the art of strategic victory. Millicent had spent her time perfecting the art of being a suburban tyrant. It wasn't going to be much of a contest. The morning of my 50th birthday dawned clear and perfect, with the kind of golden sunrise that made me grateful to be alive and living on my little ranch. I'd been up since 5 a.m. preparing for what would either be the best party of my life or the most spectacular legal battle Copper Ridge had ever seen. My money was on both happening simultaneously. I started the day by feeding my chickens and watering my recovered garden, taking extra time to document the thriving plants with photos and measurements. The vandalism from earlier in the week had actually helped several tomato plants, as the damaged stems had responded by growing stronger and producing more fruit. Nature had a funny way of turning attacks into advantages, a lesson I'd learned many times over the years. By 7 a.m., the first of my party preparations were underway. I'd hired a local barbecue company to set up their smokers on the back portion of my property, well within the agricultural zone and completely legal under county permits I'd secured weeks ago. The smell of hickory and mesquite began drifting across the neighborhood, and I noticed several neighbors peeking over their fences with appreciative expressions. Ezra showed up at 8, with his grandson Jamie, the newly minted Army Ranger I'd heard about. The young man had the same quiet confidence I recognized from my own service days, and we spent a pleasant hour setting up tables and chairs while swapping stories about military training. What neither of them knew was that Jamie's commanding officer had already RSVP'd to the party, along with several other interesting guests. "You sure you want to do this?" Ezra asked as we strung lights between the trees. "Millicent's been making calls all morning. My wife heard from her hairdresser that she's planning something big. I'm counting on it," I replied, testing the speaker system I'd rented. In fact, I'd be disappointed if she didn't pull out all the stops. You can't spring a trap if your target won't walk into it. Jamie looked between us with confusion. "What kind of trap are we talking about here?" His grandfather chuckled. "The kind where the hunter becomes the hunted, without realizing the roles have reversed. Your Mr. Blackwood here has been playing a longer game than anyone suspects." The first guests began arriving around 10 a.m., and I made sure to greet each one personally at the front of my property, where Millicent's security cameras could clearly see the growing crowd. Many were neighbors who'd suffered under her reign of terror. But mixed among them were some very special invitees who arrived in unmarked cars and casual clothes that didn't quite hide their official bearing. Sheriff Hector Castellano showed up around 10:30, driving his personal truck rather than a patrol car. He gave me a bear hug that would have crushed a smaller man and handed over a bottle of premium tequila with a grin. "Happy birthday, hermano. Sorry I'm early, but I wanted to make sure I got a good parking spot before the real show starts." "You think she'll actually do it?" I asked, accepting the bottle gratefully. "Oh, she'll do it." My dispatch already warned me about multiple calls from a Millicent Ashford about a noise disturbance at this address. I told them I'd handle it personally when the time comes. His grin turned predatory. "Can't wait to see her face." By 11 a.m., the party was in full swing. The barbecue filled the air with mouth-watering aromas. A local band was playing classic rock at a perfectly reasonable volume, and nearly 60 people were enjoying themselves on my property. I'd made sure to keep everything within legal limits. Permits posted visibly, chairs and documentation ready for any challenges. That's when I spotted Millicent at her property line with a clipboard and her phone, frantically taking photos and making calls. Beside her stood Dolores Quincy and two men I didn't recognize, all wearing HOA board badges, like they were federal marshals. I waved cheerfully and raised my beer in a mock toast, which only seemed to increase her agitation. Incoming, Esra muttered, nodding toward the street where 3 more cars were pulling up. But these weren't more party guests. District Judge Delilah Winters stepped out of the first car, dressed in jeans and a birthday-appropriate t-shirt that read, Vintage 1974. She'd been my study partner at language school before I went special operations, and she went to law school. The second car produced County Commissioner Cyrus Montgomery, another veteran who'd served in my unit before transitioning to local politics. The third held State Representative Patricia Blackwater, who'd been our intelligence officer in Afghanistan. The gang's all here, Hector said with satisfaction. This is better than cable television. Millicent must have recognized at least some of the new arrivals because her face went through several interesting color changes. But she'd committed to her course of action and wasn't backing down. At exactly noon, she marched to my front gate with her entourage and a stack of papers that looked official enough to scare most people. Mr. Blackwood, she called out in her most authoritative voice, I have here a cease and desist order for this illegal gathering, violation notices for noise ordinances, and documentation of multiple HOA covenant breaches. You will disperse this assembly immediately or face legal consequences. I strolled over to the gate, barbecue sauce still on my fingers from the excellent ribs I'd been enjoying. Morning, Millicent. Beautiful day for a birthday party, isn't it? Would you and your friends like to join us? We've got plenty of food. Her face flushed red as she thrust the papers at me. This is not a joke. You are in violation of at least 15 HOA regulations and multiple county ordinances. I've already called the police, and they'll be here any moment to shut down this circus. Oh good, I said, accepting the papers without looking at them. I was hoping Sheriff Castellano could make it. He promised to bring his famous salsa. The confusion on her face was priceless. But before she could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. 3 patrol cars turned onto our street with lights flashing. Just as she'd orchestrated, what she hadn't orchestrated was Sheriff Castellano walking over from the party with a plate of food and a concerned expression. Afternoon, Miss Ashford, he said pleasantly. I heard you've been calling about a disturbance? I've been here for about an hour and haven't noticed anything violating noise ordinances. In fact, I was just complimenting Thad on keeping the music at such a reasonable level. Millicent's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. You're already here? But this is clearly a conflict of interest. I demand you recuse yourself and send other officers. Happy to oblige, Hector said with a grin. He waved toward the patrol cars, where 3 deputies were getting out. Deputies Johnson, Martinez, and Williams. Could you come assess this situation, please? The deputies approached, and I recognized all 3 from the veterans support group I joined shortly after moving to town. They surveyed the scene with professional thoroughness before Johnson spoke up. Sir, we're not seeing any violations here. Permitted assembly, raisonnable noise levels, proper sanitation facilities, no alcohol being served to minors. Looks like a textbook example of a legal gathering to me. But, Millicent sputtered, her carefully laid plans crumbling before her eyes. This is corruption. You're all in on it together. That's when Delilah Winters decided to join the conversation. Miss Ashford, I'd be very careful about making accusations of corruption without evidence. As a sitting judge, I take such allegations seriously, and false accusations can have legal consequences. Millicent's eyes widened as she recognized the judge. Your Honor, what are you doing here? Celebrating my old friend's birthday. Delilah replied calmly. We served together many years ago. Small world, isn't it? But Millicent wasn't done yet. She pulled out her phone and started recording. This is all being documented. The entire county government is conspiring against a lawful HOA board trying to maintain property values and community standards. Speaking of documentation, I said mildly, did you ever find out who vandalized my garden? The police report I filed included some interesting evidence. Her recording hand trembled slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. Really? Because the security footage was quite clear, and the threatening text I received last night from an unknown number was particularly interesting. Sheriff Castellano, didn't you mention something about tracing that number? Hector nodded gravely. Phone records are wonderful things. Amazing what digital footprints people leave when they think they're being clever. The color drained from Millicent's face, but she rallied with the desperation of someone who'd gone too far to back down. "You're trying to intimidate me, but it won't work. I've already contacted Channel 7 News about this gross abuse of power. They'll be here any minute to expose all of you." "Excellent," said a new voice from behind me. Nadia Volko, now a senior investigative reporter for the state's largest newspaper, stepped forward with her photographer. "I was hoping to get your side of the story. Miss Ashford, my editor is very interested in the pattern of HOA violations followed by property sales to your husband's company. Would you like to comment on the record?" The trap had been sprung so perfectly, I almost felt sorry for Millicent. Almost. She stood there surrounded by law enforcement, judiciary, and media, all of whom were there legally as private citizens celebrating a birthday. While she'd created the very public confrontation she now found herself losing. This is a setup," she whispered, the reality finally dawning on her. "No," I corrected gently. "This is what happens when you threaten the wrong person and assume your petty power extends beyond your actual authority. Every single person here is a law-abiding citizen attending a legal gathering. You're the one who chose to make it a confrontation." That's when Bernard Hutchins surprised everyone by stepping forward from Millicent's group. "I can't do this anymore," he announced, pulling out a folder from inside his jacket. "Millicent, I've been keeping copies of everything. The false violations, the kickbacks from your husband's company, the missing HOA funds. I'm done being complicit." He handed the folder to Sheriff Castellano, who accepted it with professional interest. "Mr. Hutchins, are you saying you have evidence of criminal activity?" 5 years' worth, Bernard confirmed, his relief palpable. I kept thinking she'd stop, that things would get better, but after seeing what she did to Mr. Blackwood's garden on that security footage, I realized she's never going to stop on her own. Millicent's carefully constructed world collapsed in real time. Dolores stepped away from her, hands raised as if to ward off association. The 2 unknown board members suddenly remembered urgent appointments elsewhere, and the Channel 7 news van that pulled up captured not the abuse of power she'd promised them, but her own spectacular downfall. "Bernard, you spineless little man," she hissed. "You think you can betray me? I made you, without me. You're nothing, without you." Bernard replied with more backbone than I'd ever seen from him. "I'm free." Sheriff Castellano reviewed the documents quickly, his expression growing more serious with each page. "Miss Ashford, based on this preliminary evidence, I'm going to need you to come to the station for questioning regarding potential embezzlement and fraud charges." "You can't arrest me at this circus," she shrieked, gesturing wildly at my party. "This is all his fault. He started this with his illegal garden." "My legal garden," I corrected, "on agricultural zoned land, with proper permits, following all applicable laws. Unlike, apparently, your financial management of HOA funds." Nadia's photographer was having a field day capturing every moment while she conducted impromptu interviews with neighbors eager to share their stories. The Channel 7 reporter looked like he'd won the lottery, getting exclusive footage of what would become the biggest HOA scandal in state history. As Sheriff Castellano escorted Millicent to a patrol car, she turned back one last time. Her perfect composure finally shattered completely. "You destroyed everything, my community, my standards, my life's work." "No," I replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You destroyed it yourself the moment you decided to use your position for personal gain instead of serving the community. I just made sure everyone could see it happening." The rest of the party took on a celebratory atmosphere that went beyond just my birthday. Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak up for years shared stories and laughed together. The band played requests. The barbecue kept flowing. And for the first time since I'd moved in, Copper Ridge felt like a real community instead of Millicent's personal kingdom. As the sun began to set, Ezra found me sitting on my porch steps, watching the party wind down. "Hell of a birthday party," he said, settling beside me with a groan. "Think you might have overdone it a bit?" "Possibly," I admitted. "But sometimes you have to go big to make a point." "And the point was?" I thought about it for a moment. "That bullies only have the power we give them. Millicent spent years making people afraid. But fear only works if you let it. Once people saw she could be challenged, her whole house of cards came down. Speaking of which, Delilah Winters joined us, still carrying her plate of barbecue. The HOA board will need new leadership. Interested in the job? I laughed. Probably louder than necessary. I just wanted to grow some tomatoes in peace. I'm not looking to run anything. That's exactly why you should do it, she countered. The best leaders are the ones who don't want power for its own sake. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in front of a packed community center, having just been unanimously elected as the new HOA president. My first act was to suspend all pending violations pending a comprehensive review of the covenants. My second was to establish a community garden program that would allow any resident to apply for a plot in the common areas. Bernard Hutchins, who'd been retained as secretary after his courageous disclosure, helped implement new financial transparency measures. Every expense was documented. Every decision was voted on publicly. And the culture of fear that had gripped Copper Ridge for 5 years began to fade like morning mist. Millicent Ashford eventually pled guilty to embezzlement and fraud charges, receiving 3 years probation and restitution requirements that would take a decade to fulfill. Her husband's landscaping company lost all HOA contracts after a competitive bidding process, and their property investment schemes unraveled when previous victims came forward with their own documentation. The day she moved out of Copper Ridge, I was working in my garden when the moving truck passed by. She didn't look in my direction, but I saw her shoulders tense as she drove past the thriving vegetables and happy chickens that had started it all. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only relief that the community could finally heal. 6 months after the birthday party that changed everything, Copper Ridge Estates had transformed completely. The monthly HOA meetings had become community potlucks where neighbors actually enjoyed gathering. The common areas bloomed with garden plots, tended by residents of all ages. And my ranch garden had become a teaching space, where I showed interested neighbors how to grow their own food. Jamie, Ezra's grandson, stopped by one afternoon while on leave, helping me install a new irrigation line for the expanded herb garden. My grandfather told me the whole story. He said as we worked, how you planned everything from the beginning, knowing she'd escalate until she destroyed herself. I didn't plan for her to be corrupt. I clarified. I just recognized a bully and knew that bullies always escalate when challenged. My job was to make sure when she escalated, she'd be doing it in front of the right audience. Still, he said with admiration, using her own tactics against her while staying completely legal? That's some Sunday-tsu level strategy. I smiled, remembering similar conversations with young soldiers years ago. The best victories are the ones where your enemy defeats themselves. All you have to do is create the conditions for their nature to be revealed. That evening, as I collected eggs from my chickens and surveyed my thriving garden, I reflected on how a simple desire for agricultural freedom had led to the liberation of an entire community. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can trigger the biggest changes, especially when you refuse to back down from someone who's forgotten that power is meant to serve others, not yourself. The security cameras I'd installed to catch vandals now recorded children learning to plant seeds and elderly neighbors sharing gardening wisdom. The HOA that had once been a weapon of control had become a tool for community building, and the ranch garden that Millicent had tried to destroy had become the heart of a neighborhood that finally felt like home. As the stars came out and my chickens settled in for the night, I raised a glass to the quiet evening and the hard-won peace. Tomorrow there would be new challenges and new projects. But tonight I could enjoy the simple satisfaction of vegetables growing, neighbors laughing, and a community free from the tyranny of those who mistake authority for ownership. The war was over, and the garden had won. Sometimes that's the best revenge of all, when life and growth triumph over those who only know how to destroy. And if anyone else wanted to challenge my right to grow tomatoes in peace, well, I still had plenty of room at my birthday parties for new friends in high places. The next morning's sunrise found me exactly where I wanted to be, knee-deep in soil, planting the future one seed at a time, in a community that had learned the power of standing together against those who would divide them. Millicent had called the cops on my ranch garden. Instead, she'd walked right into a trap built from nothing more than truth, community, courage, and the unshakable bonds between old soldiers who'd learned long ago that the best battles are won before they're even fought. What I didn't mention was the personal cost of becoming an inadvertent reformer, the speaking engagements, the consulting requests, the constant emails from people dealing with their own HOA tyrantsit had all taken time away from the simple pleasure of growing vegetables that had started everything. But every time I felt overwhelmed, I'd remember the look on a child's face when they harvested their first tomato, or the pride in a neighbor's voice when they shared produce they'd grown themselves. The opposition claims you're anti-OA, the committee chair noted, yet you currently serve as president of your own HOA. How do you reconcile that? I'm not anti-HO, I replied firmly. I'm anti-corruption, anti-bullying, and anti-using positions of small authority to terrorize neighbors. HOAs can be wonderful tools for community building when they remember their purpose is to serve residents, not control them. The Copper Ridge model proves that accountability and freedom can coexist with property maintenance and community standards. After my testimony concluded, I found myself in a quiet corner of the Capitol building, checking messages from home. Ezra had sent a photo of the newest addition to our community Gardena greenhouse built entirely by volunteer labor, where we could grow vegetables year-round. His message read, "Thought you'd want to see what your troublemaking has led to." Millicent would have an aneurysm. The mention of Millicent reminded me of the strangest twist in our ongoing saga last month. She'd actually reached out through her lawyer with an unexpected request. She wanted to interview me for a book she was writing about her experiences in community leadership. The lawyer had seemed embarrassed, even relaying the request, especially the part where she'd suggested I might want to set the record straight about my militant gardening agenda. I declined, of course, but not without sending back a message of my own, a photo of our thriving community garden with children of all backgrounds learning together, elderly residents teaching traditional techniques, and veterans finding peace in the soil. The caption had simply read, "This is what community leadership actually looks like." On my flight home from DC, I found myself seated next to a woman who recognized me from a news article about the congressional testimony. She ran an HOA in Michigan that was dealing with their own version of Millicenta president who'd issued fines for bird feeders, children's chalk art, and vegetable gardens. By the time we landed, she had a plan to organize her neighbors and implement Copper Ridge-style reforms. "The thing is," she said as we gathered our luggage, "most people don't realize they have power. They just pay their fines and grumble privately. Your story showed us that one person standing up can inspire a whole community to find its backbone." That evening, I returned to find my ranch garden in full summer glory. The tomatoes I'd planted that had started this whole adventure had descendants now in gardens throughout the neighborhood. The apple trees we'd guerrilla planted in the common areas during our resistance days were now official community orchards, their fruit free for anyone to harvest. Sheriff Castellano stopped by as I was watering the herbs, now retired, but still a regular presence in the neighborhood. "Heard your testimony went well," he said, accepting the beer I offered. "Think Congress will actually do anything?" "Maybe. Maybe not," I admitted, but that's not really the point anymore. The real victory is that people know they can fight back. Every time someone stands up to an HOA bully now, they know they're not alone. There's a whole network of us who've been there and won. As the sun set over Copper Ridge Estates, I reflected on the journey from a simple violation notice to congressional testimony. Millicent had been right about one thing: I had destroyed her vision of community. But in its place, we'd built something far more valuable. A neighborhood where authority served rather than ruled, where diversity was celebrated rather than suppressed, and where the simple act of growing food had become a symbol of freedom. The security cameras that still monitored my property rarely captured anything more dramatic than raccoons trying to raid the compost bins. The HOA meetings that had once been battlegrounds were now potlucks with business conducted between recipe exchanges, and the ranch garden that had started it all continued to thrive. A living reminder that sometimes the best response to tyranny is simply refusing to stop growing. As I headed inside, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. Opening it, I found a photo of a small vegetable garden with a handwritten sign, "Inspired by Copper Ridge Fighting, OA tyranny one tomato at a time. Below it was a message. Thank you for showing us the way. The revolution grows. I smiled. Saving the photo to the collection of hundreds of similar images from across the country, Millicent had called the cops on my ranch garden. But instead of shutting it down, she'd planted the seeds for a nationwide movement. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about these things. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to help communities find their strength. But tonight, I was content to sit on my porch, listening to the night sounds of a neighborhood at peace, knowing that somewhere out there, another person was planting vegetables in defiance of petty tyranny. And another community was discovering that the best fertilizer for freedom is the courage to say no to those who forget their servants, not masters. The ranch garden stood as proof that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can grow into the mightiest forests of change. And if anyone else wanted to test that principle, well, my tomatoes and I would be ready. With a nationwide network of freedom gardeners at our backs and the law firmly on our side. The cops had been called, the trap had been sprung, and justice had grown from the soil of community courage. Not a bad harvest for what started as just a man, his chickens, and a dream of fresh vegetables. Not bad at all.